So utilitarianism is an instance of a consequentialist theory in ethics. And consequentialist theories, as you recall, suppose that the ethical standing of any given action is determined exclusively and exhaustively by its consequences, some specified set of consequences. And in utilitarianism, the ethical standing of some action is determined exclusively and exhaustively by its ability to create the greatest good for the greatest number, the happiness consequences of those actions. And this class of criticisms attacks that underlying connection that is presupposed by utilitarianism between the production of happiness on the one hand and the ethical standing of an action on the other. And Rachel discusses three types of cases. Each type of case points to a different ethical property that doesn't seem to correspond to or correlate perfectly with production of the greatest good for the greatest number. In other words, it seems to break that happiness, ethically praiseworthy connection that's strongly presupposed by the theory. And so specifically, Rachel will look at cases where actions seem unjust, yet produce the greatest happiness. Then he'll look at cases where actions seem to violate the rights of individuals, yet produce the greatest happiness. And then finally, he'll look at actions that seem to ignore our past decisions or commitments, that seem ethically relevant, that create obligations or duties on our part from the past, that get ignored or set aside because not performing that action or not fulfilling that duty or obligation will create a greater net happiness. So the first example that Rachel's looks at is an example that he thinks depicts a patently unjust action that nevertheless leads to the greatest good for the greatest number, and hence is ethically praiseworthy, according to utilitarianism. So he borrows this example from McCloskey. And in this example, in a state where there's a great deal of racial tension, the story goes, a white woman is sexually assaulted, and the seeming suspect is an African American. And this is causing a great deal of racial tension. It looks as though racial riots are going to break out, and this would cause a great deal of chaos and unhappiness. So some respected figure uses their position to falsely accuse someone, thereby diffusing the tension by placing the blame on a single individual and hence avoiding the tremendous amount of unhappiness that would result from these widespread race riots. Now, this action, Rachel's note, seems morally despicable, and he characterizes it as being patently unjust. Nevertheless, it creates the greatest happiness, certainly better than not doing it from the perspective of what net happiness will result from the action. As a result, the utilitarian seems to have to claim that this morally despicable and unjust action is in fact morally praiseworthy because it produces the greatest happiness when compared to the action of not falsely accusing some person. Now, personally, I find this case to muddy the waters between violating someone's rights and acting unjustly. And there are lots of other examples that theorists turn to when they want to talk about cases where actions seem to be unjust and yet produce greatest good for the greatest number, and hence break that connection between maximum net happiness and moral praiseworthiness. And so oftentimes theorists will use free riders to illustrate this point. Free riders are people who take advantage of the conventions, laws, ethical rules of their society to increase their own happiness without dramatically decreasing the happiness of other people. They don't violate anyone's rights in particular because they're not actually causing any dramatic harm to anyone. Nevertheless, their actions don't seem to be just or fair. So, for example, in the context of our society here in California, right, certain people can increase their happiness without any dramatic negative unhappiness resulting by acting as free riders. So, for instance, as long as lots of people carpool and buy fuel-efficient cars, then air pollution and contributions to global warming aren't going to dramatically increase if a few people violate those sort of conventions about how to travel from point A to point B and buy very polluting, gas-guzzling cars like Hummers. And the example of someone who determines that they'd be happiest if they didn't vote, because voting on their part causes them net unhappiness, but doesn't change the outcome, decreasing the unhappiness of people in general. So all of these cases are cases where people seem to act in a way that is unfair or unjust, but that actually results in an increase in net happiness because their actions don't have any significant impact on the overall happiness of other people, but they do have a significant impact on themselves. So other examples that people will often bring up are people who cheat on their taxes. Right? The idea here being, as long as the government gets enough money to fund federal programs, or it can borrow that money, then an individual can increase their happiness by not paying their taxes, by lying about their tax bill, without dramatically impacting the overall happiness that results from a well-funded, fiscally solvent government. The next example that Rachel looks at is an example where we see a result of greatest happiness from an action that violates someone's rights. And he bases this example off an extrapolation of a real-life case that it reports, this case of Miss Angela York. Miss Angela York was sexually assaulted in 1958, went to the police department, reported the assault. The police officer who took her report then deceived and manipulated her, told her that he had to take pictures of her naked and sexually suggestive poses, which wasn't actually part of her sexual assault report, and hence violated her rights. And as Rachel tells us, she in fact sued and won her case. Nevertheless, Rachel says, suppose we extrapolate this terrible case, morally despicable actions of this police officer, and imagine that the police officer never gets caught, that the police officer's individual happiness is greatly increased, but because Ms. York never discovers this problem, never realizes her rights have been violated, her net happiness isn't dramatically impacted by this, and since the officers never discovered, neither is the overall happiness. So in this extrapolated case, we can imagine this officer or multiple officers increasing their happiness significantly by enjoying these photos without dramatically increasing the overall happiness because they never get caught their deception and manipulation, their horrible violation of Miss York's rights never is detected and hence never has a negative impact on overall happiness. And so this case really does seem to illustrate a case of morally despicable action that violates an individual's rights, but which nevertheless results in an increase in the net happiness. Now, theorists often point to another example, a sort of infamous example, the example of the unwilling organ donor that was lampooned by Monty Python in the 70s as a different illustration of violating rights to secure greater happiness. And we've discussed this example sort of briefly. Here we have someone who gets killed for the purposes of harvesting all their organs because the net unhappiness that results from killing that single individual, the unhappiness of the individual, the family, people who know them, is dramatically less than the happiness that gets produced by saving, say, 7, 8, 10 people through organ transplantation, and the happiness that results from their family and friends not having to endure their death as a result of organ failure. So all of these cases, again, they seem morally despicable. They seem morally blameworthy. They seem to violate individuals' rights, but that violation seems to result in an increase in the net happiness, causing the greatest good for the greatest number, and hence utilitarianism seems committed to saying that these actions are in fact morally praiseworthy. In the next segment, we'll look at the final version of this class of objections to utilitarianism, and then we'll turn to the third and last class of objections.